Welcome. When running a large complex business, or even a medium-sized complex business, managing revenue successfully in a predictable fashion with high degree of accuracy is one of the most essential pillars of one's success. We often describe it in our research that if you do revenue management well, you might get a pat on the back. Many people probably won't even notice. But if you do it poorly, your executive team could end up in jail because these things are, especially if you're a public company, are punishable in very, very serious manner. So thinking about how revenue management is evolving, we wanted to take a look at what's happening in this area, how that area is evolving, how is it being addressed with modern technology, with modern tools, not the stuff that's 20, 25, 30 years old. And we are very fortunate today because we have with us a special guest, Mr. Yousef Ymore, who is the founder and chief executive officer of BluLogix, a company that specializes in monetization and specifically has a focus and a lot of subject matter expertise in helping channel-based businesses achieve success with monetization. So, Yousef, welcome. It's a pleasure, as always, to have you as a guest and looking forward to this conversation. So, to start, let's maybe do a little bit of definitional work here. So, revenue management is not new. We've been trying to solve this problem for ages, right? With tools, the technology are changing and changing rapidly, especially now with AI being at the edge here. How should people be thinking about revenue management from a modern perspective? What is kind of an interesting, creative, innovative way to approach this problem? How do you think people should be solving this problem?
It's interesting that you mentioned AI in the question, because that's one of the new challenges, or rather undecided paths, if you like, on the technology when it comes to numbers. We've seen a lot of success for AI, and I'm not shifting away from the revenue question. I'll get to that, but since AI is an interesting subject, AI has presented to the technology world a lot of success in the generative text so far, and it added a lot of values. There's no doubt about that. But we still do not see successful implementation of AI in the numbers world. I think we still have some time to realize the value of that. However, having said that, and we will get to that when we talk about the prediction and the forecast side of revenue, it can be proven very useful when you talk about prediction. We actually, in the company, use AI to help us get some prediction data that we can give to customers. On the AI side, we combine what we call margin analyzer. We track margin, and we will talk about that at some point in this discussion. We take the data related to margins, we take the data related to forecast, we take the data related to channel and structure, we take the data that is being tracked as revenue recorded already, and we let AI help us, giving us some prediction model. This is how your future growth is going to look like, and these are some recommendations of areas that you need to focus on and learn from. That's how, at least, we've seen some implementation of AI. For us, we've seen it in the tools. We're actually doing that as we speak. Going back to the revenue, people talk about ERP a lot, and people talk about monetization tools. One of the wrong conception in the industry, it's either or, and that's not the case. I think organizations, business organizations, and of course channel-oriented businesses are part of that. You cannot do without ERP, and at the same time, ERP cannot replace and cannot give you what monetization tools can give you today.
Why is that?
I'll tell you because that's a very interesting question. Let's try to explain the difference between ERP and monetization tools. ERP starts when the revenue is generated, i.e. when the invoice is generated. ERP tools are not designed to help businesses in the business process prior to that, and I will talk about that in a minute. When the invoice is generated, that's when ARP plays a role in it. That's when it becomes to track invoices and revenue for you. And there's a lot of tools that have been designed for that, but it's only designed for that. When you ask ERP systems to do something prior to generation of invoice, that's when you face challenges with ERP. It's very good at what it does when the revenue, i.e. the invoice, is generated. That's what it's designed to do. Whereas monetization tools are things that include catalog. This is where you define what you sell. Catalog is about defining what you sell, defining how you sell it, and define it how much you sell it for. That's what essentially the catalog is. So translating your traditional or transactional business and converting that into today's world, which is more like subscription, usage, consumption, recurring revenue, that conversion requires a very powerful catalog tool, which is, like I said, what you sell, how you sell it, and how much you sell it for. Then you've got billing, of course, that's the probably most common components of monetization tools. How do you generate the invoices from all the data feeds that you get from different sources? Then you get the service management. You can't generate accurate billing without managing the service life cycle. When do you turn the service on? How do you turn the service on? Which platform do you turn it on? What are the intricacies, dependencies, and interconnection between all these components? Then you have the customer lifecycle management, including channel, because customers today are not necessarily customers that you directly manage, but also customers that come to you through the channel, which is becoming a very important. I mean, traditionally, depending on the industry, channel has contributed to something between 30 to 40% of businesses. And in some cases, it goes to 60%. So you can't really grow this business without being able to manage or enable or empower channel. So that becomes part of the sales cycle and part of the customer life cycle management. Then obviously you get as part of that all the revenue management. But revenue management, and what I'll come to a point where what's the difference between the revenue management you can get in ERP and the revenue management you can get in monetization tools. ERP generally gives you data when you close the month. There are so many good examples about that. You don't really get accurate data from ERP until you actually close a cycle, say the month of the business. You close the month, you know how much the cost was, and you know how much the revenue was, and you know your other costs, and then you create your balance sheet and you start looking at your revenue. This is a bit too late for the business that we live in today. You need this information live, real time, on a daily basis. And ERPs cannot produce that. They're not designed basically for that. And this is where the value of the revenue management that you get from monetization tools. So these are just definitions. That's the difference between what you get from a monetization tool and what you get from an ERP.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to maybe talk a bit more about how revenue management is evolving, and specifically with kind of and you mentioned this, the timing aspect, how people used to use revenue management at the end of a cycle, whether it's a month, a quarter, or a year, and nowadays companies want to sort of use it much more frequently, maybe not real time, but say quick time. And this always reminds me of an anecdote you probably heard me share it before. I remember when in 2008, 2009 timeframe, the U.S. government took over General Motors because it was failing badly during the financial crisis, and they appointed a former private equity executive, Steve Ratner, who was formerly a New York Times journalist as well, and they made him the tsar of GM. And his very first question to the finance department at GM was, "What is our cash position?" And the response from the finance department was, "It will take us 60 days to figure this out." And at this point, Steve, who was a relatively mild-mannered, very kind of cerebral kind of a guy, just literally explodes, because he's like, "This cannot be. We have to be able to see where our revenue is, what our costs are. I'm not saying real time, but within a day, I should be able to know where do we stand, because I have to make decisions. have to rescue this. Otherwise, everybody loses their jobs. So that's been kind of an undercurrent in a lot of the evolution of modern finance automation software, including monetization, including revenue management. But how realistic do you think this is? Is this something that is more in our mind, and this is probably some years away, or are we much closer to it already today?
I think the simple answer to that is the same tool that you should be using to calculate your invoice and revenue is the tool that has to calculate and track your cost. And at the same time, when you actually generate the invoice to the customer or to the reseller, that is when you have to calculate the cost at the granular level. Mm-hmm. If you do not do that, then you're going to always be behind on a comprehensive revenue management strategy. And there are multiple pillars for revenue management. You can't just look at one aspect of it. But let me share with you a story for one of the resellers of a big provider in the industry. I know they came to us with a solution, with a challenge. They're buying from this big service provider for a price of X, and they're selling it for a price of Y. And there is a margin of 20% that they're putting basically on top of that. And in some cases, they have to give discounts, so they probably go down to 10%. But months later, when the ERP system, when their accounting system actually does close the books, and they look at the invoice that comes to them from that upstream provider and the invoice that they generate to the customer, they look at it, and in some cases, they're actually losing money. They're losing money. So where does this 20% margin or 15% margin or 10% margin going? It's disappearing somewhere.
Right.
And because you don't have the granular data to analyze that.
So lack of timing, really being
Late,
on top of
exactly,
being late. Yeah,
exactly.
Costing you money.
So when we did the analysis, it was basically very simple. I was just about to say the name. I'm glad I didn't. When the service provider was sending the invoice, they were adding a recovery fee of 13% to the invoice. It's not in the price list. When you look at the price list, the price says X. And when you mark it up, your Y is actually X plus 20%. But in the invoice, there is an extra fee that is appearing there in the invoice, which is 13%, which is eating up their margin. So when you come 3 months later to try to analyze that, you're actually not realizing where the revenue is, because you're still comparing the cost that you think is in the price list and the price that you're selling it. We took their data, we configured it, because we have a component in the system that's called Margin Analyzer, which is basically the way to generate the cost at the same time you generate the invoice. And the system shows you, here is your revenue and here is your cost. And there is a third component to that. Here is the cost that came to you from the vendor.
Right.
And it does compare these 3 points.
I'm listening to you, and it occurs to me, like we always say, why say monetization or revenue management specialized tool versus ERP? And it almost sounds to me like one should be asking questions like, why ERP? If ERP can only record things at fixed intervals, and it does a lot, general ledger management and allocation of different expenses and so on. But it sounds like a lot of these monetization tools can nowadays handle a good chunk of what ERP is supposed to do.
Monetization tools
Am I wrong?
cannot. Well, the assumption is not right, is not accurate.
Okay.
Monetization tools are not intended to give you a balance sheet. They're not intended to track your payroll. They're not intended to generate your revenue booking versus GAAP accounting. They're not intended to calculate basically your GAAP compliance. They're not intended to calculate your other third-party cost. It's not meant for that. That's what ERP does. At the end, you need a trial balance and a balance sheet that you have to generate on a monthly basis to run your business, and that's what ERP is for. That is not what monetization is for, and this is where you draw the line. You need both tools.
I want to go back and talk about kind of your definition of how you guys see it with 6 pillars of revenue management.
what we consider revenue management is the following tools. One, the margin analyzer. It starts with being able to track the cost in real time along with billing. In other words, the system, when it generates an invoice, it has to also calculate the cost and be able to produce basically the delta, which is what we call the margin between your version of calculating the cost and the vendor's cost that is provided to you through an invoice or some electronic meal. So that's the first component. The second component, monetization tools has different ways to interface with an ERP. But we find the most effective way to do that is by actually having a built-in GL interface that is in the monetization tools, which reflects the same chart of account that does exist in the ERP. It makes the integration easier. You don't have to manipulate data on the fly when you're pushing data and synchronizing data between the two systems. So that's the second piece of it. And it has to be, with every one of these components that I'm talking about, there has to be a hierarchy behind it.
Right.
That supports that, especially when you have a channel, which is the third component of revenue management. The third one has to do with revenue recognition. It's an integral part. Today, you sell a subscription for a year in advance. You have to realize.
Even if you're dealing with usage revenue, and
absolutely, it's a liability.
Prepaid, and you have
absolutely.
to, things happen, transactions happen.
Exactly. Exactly. Revenue. That's basically revenue recognition. Then there are two aspects related to the actual revenue transaction. One called revenue tracking, which is every revenue aspect that you've generated so far. So you want to be able to track it based on the hierarchy that we just talked about. And if you have a channel, you want to know which revenue came from which channel. And if you combine that with basically the margin analyzer, okay, which channel is giving me more revenue and which channel is giving me higher margin, and which product against these basically hierarchies is, so it goes into the analysis. And the last piece of it is what we call revenue forecast. And we have two aspects of that. Revenue forecast, the first part of it is for my existing orders, contracts, and customers, and with active services. What is my revenue forecast going to look like over a period of time to come? 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, taking into account everything that might terminate, and you have a termination date for every contract that might have an expiry. If you actually have good tools to track that, you know very well when you have to talk to your customers to renew something that is active today. So the renewal management, we consider it part of that. That's revenue forecast. And there is the final aspect of it, which is called revenue prediction. Okay, now the difference between forecast and prediction is, well, forecast is based on actual active services and data that I have, but prediction is, okay, how do I grow my business beyond what I already have, and which sector, channel, outlet, service, product should I focus on, and even market trend. So we combine margin analyzer with hierarchy and revenue tracking and revenue forecast to generate, using AI, what your prediction should look like. Our main focus on the next gen revenue management in our platform tool is actually focusing on that piece, because it's a very valuable capability that we intend to provide to our customers.